Imagine yourself sitting in a packed courtroom where every pair of eyes is fixed on one man. The prosecutor stands confidently, armed with a sharp arsenal of evidence. The judge, stern and resolute, is ready to deliver the verdict. The whole world waits for Elon Musk to fail. But with just one sentence, Musk silences the entire room. How did Elon Musk not only defend himself, but also shake the very foundation of the legal system? What happened that transformed the judge's attitude from contempt to admiration? And most importantly, is this a sign that the law itself needs to evolve? You cannot miss this story. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss out on Golden Story's gripping videos, intense showdowns, stunning turnarounds, and invaluable lessons from the greatest minds. Like and comment your thoughts. Should the law evolve like technology? Turn on notifications to be the first to catch our next groundbreaking story. Part 1. The trial that shook the world. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was occupied. Reporters scribbled in their notepads. Cameras clicked relentlessly, and the murmurs of industry leaders filled the air like a low-frequency hum of anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate trial. This was a showdown that had the potential to redefine the relationship between innovation and law. At the center of it all sat Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, the so-called visionary, the man who had built rockets, electric cars, and AI systems that had changed the world. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he wasn't the architect of the future. He was the defendant, standing accused of financial manipulation, tax evasion, and market interference on a scale so vast that it had sent shockwaves through Wall Street. The presiding judge, a veteran of high-profile corporate litigation, adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room. Judge Nathaniel Hayes was not the type to be easily impressed, a man known for his meticulous approach and no-nonsense demeanor. He had built his reputation on dismantling the legal defenses of billionaires and CEOs who thought their wealth made them untouchable. But even he knew this case was different. Unlike the usual courtroom circus where executives fumbled through prepared statements and hid behind teams of elite attorneys, Musk was here alone. No overpaid legal team whispering in his ear, no high-powered corporate defenders shielding him from scrutiny. Just him, standing tall, composed, and entirely unshaken. As he walked toward the defense table, his movements were measured, almost calculated. His tailored suit was impeccable, but it wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to command. His expression, however, was the most unsettling of all. It wasn't fear, nor arrogance, nor even defiance. It was something else entirely, something that made even the most seasoned legal minds in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Confidence. Not the bravado of a man who thought he could talk his way out of trouble, but the unshakable composure of someone who knew something no one else did. A man who had already played out this battle in his mind and had come prepared, not just to defend himself, but to turn the entire case on its head. Across the room, the lead prosecutor, James Whitaker, studied Musk carefully. Whitaker had built his career on taking down corporate giants. He had prosecuted hedge fund billionaires, tech moguls, and pharmaceutical tycoons who had spent their lives manipulating loopholes in the system. He had never lost a case. And today, he intended to add Musk to that list. This is going to be a long day for him, Whitaker thought, glancing at the stack of evidence in front of him. He had everything: internal emails, financial reports, whistleblower testimonies. The case was airtight, or so he believed. Judge Hayes cleared his throat and tapped his gavel against the bench. The murmurs died instantly. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. He turned to Musk. "Mr. Musk, you are here today under serious allegations, manipulating financial markets, evading federal tax laws, and using your influence to disrupt economic stability." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand the gravity of these charges?" Musk met his gaze without hesitation. "I do, Your Honor." His voice was steady, devoid of the usual playfulness he often displayed in interviews or Twitter feuds. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. He had expected a nervous executive, a CEO, trying to talk his way out of a guilty verdict. But what he saw was something else entirely, something that made him, for the first time in a long while, uncertain about how this trial would unfold. Musk didn't just seem ready. He seemed like he was waiting for this moment, and that unsettled him. The prosecution stood up. Whitaker straightened his tie, his posture exuding the confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury with a practiced tone, "today is not about business. It's not about innovation. It's about accountability." He gestured toward Musk. "What we have here is a man who has built his empire on the premise that rules do not apply to him. A man who believes that because he creates, because he builds, because he innovates, he is untouchable. But today, in this courtroom, we will prove otherwise." Musk didn't flinch. He remained seated, listening, absorbing every word. The gallery was silent, hanging onto every moment. No one knew how this would end, but one thing was certain. This was not just another trial. This was a battle between two forces: the rigid, unyielding structure of the law and the relentless, unpredictable force of disruption. And the real question wasn't whether Musk would win or lose. It was whether the system itself could handle what was coming next. Part 2. The game turned around, from doubt to strategy. The courtroom was thick with tension. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the weight of the moment. The prosecutor, James Whitaker, strode confidently to the center of the room, his polished shoes clicking against the cold marble floor. He had been preparing for this for months, and now it was time to put an end to Elon Musk's illusion of invincibility. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Whitaker began, his voice crisp and deliberate, "we are here today because one man, this man, has made a mockery of the very system that governs us all." He turned toward Musk, letting the words sink in. Musk didn't react. He remained still, hands folded, his face unreadable. Whitaker reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He held it up for everyone to see before carefully laying it on the prosecution table. Then, with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who knew he was holding all the cards, he flipped it open. "These," he said, gesturing to the documents inside, "are financial records, internal emails, confidential memos, evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mr. Musk engaged in a calculated effort to manipulate markets, evade taxes, and deceive regulatory authorities." He took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice as if sharing a dangerous secret. "We even have recordings," he said, glancing toward the judge. "Phone calls, conversations where Mr. Musk discusses his strategy for outmaneuvering the law." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the most skeptical observers felt a shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about bending the rules anymore. If what Whitaker was saying was true, Musk had gone beyond that. He had knowingly engineered his own loopholes, playing the system like a grandmaster moving pieces on a chessboard. Judge Hayes, ever the stoic, adjusted his glasses and turned toward Musk. "Mr. Musk," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority, "you've heard the allegations. Before we proceed, do you have any preliminary statement to make?" Musk didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, in a tone so calm it was almost unsettling, he said, "I prefer to hear all the charges before I respond, Your Honor." The response, though simple, sent a ripple through the room. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't scrambling to defend himself. He was waiting. Whitaker smirked. "Of course," he said. "Let's not keep Mr. Musk waiting." He turned back to the jury. "Now, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a company so powerful, so deeply embedded in the fabric of our economy, that it can shift entire markets with a single announcement. Imagine a CEO who knows this, who understands that every word he speaks can send stocks soaring or crashing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Now, imagine that CEO using that power deliberately, manipulating the system, skirting regulations, and pushing boundaries until the law itself struggles to catch up." He picked up a document from his stack and held it up. "This is an internal memo from Tesla's finance division, signed off by Mr. Musk himself. In it, you'll see direct references to what he called regulatory arbitrage, a fancy way of saying bending the rules until they break. A low murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Analysts exchanged nervous glances. This was serious. Judge Hayes leaned forward. "Mr. Whitaker, I trust you'll be presenting authenticated evidence to support these claims?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Whitaker said, nodding confidently. He reached for another folder. "In fact, let's listen to a recording. A conversation between Mr. Musk and his senior financial advisors." He pressed a button on a small speaker system. A faint click, then static, then, "Elon, if we push this through before the SEC catches on, we can." "They won't." Musk's voice cut in calm, controlled. "Regulations move slower than innovation. By the time they figure it out, we'll have already pivoted." A collective gasp spread through the room. Whitaker pressed pause, then turned back to Musk. "Would you care to explain, Mr. Musk?" For the first time, the billionaire moved. He shifted slightly in his seat, stretching his fingers along the table before folding them again. But he still didn't speak. Judge Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Musk, the court expects an answer." Musk finally exhaled, his eyes locking onto Whitaker's. "Explain what?" he said, his tone impossibly neutral. Whitaker scoffed. "Explain how that recording isn't proof that you knowingly manipulated financial regulations to benefit your company." Musk nodded slightly, as if he'd been waiting for that exact question. He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I have no issue explaining myself. But before I do, I'd like to clarify something." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "We're assuming that context doesn't matter, that this one clip, played in isolation, tells the entire story." He gestured toward the speaker. "But does it? Or is it just part of the conversation?" Whitaker's expression hardened. "Are you saying the recording is fake?" Musk smirked. "I'm saying cherry-picking a conversation to fit a narrative doesn't make it evidence. It makes it propaganda." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Whitaker's confident smirk faltered, just for a second. Judge Hayes tapped his gavel. "Let's stay on track, gentlemen." The judge then turned back to Musk, his gaze unwavering. "Regardless of context, Mr. Musk, the prosecution has presented a compelling case. You are accused of deliberately exploiting regulatory gaps, of manipulating markets for personal and corporate gain." He leaned forward. "So let me ask you directly, did you, or did you not, knowingly take advantage of loopholes in the financial system?" The room fell deathly silent. Musk held the judge's gaze for a long moment. Then, finally he spoke. "You're asking the wrong question, Your Honor." The judge's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Musk straightened in his seat. "The real question isn't whether I took advantage of the system." He let his words hang in the air before delivering the punchline. "It's why the system was so easy to take advantage of in the first place." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since the trial began, the power in the room shifted. This was no longer just a legal battle. This was a reckoning. Part 3. Elon Musk turns the tables. The courtroom, moments ago a sea of murmurs and hushed anticipation, had settled into an eerie silence. The weight of the prosecution's case loomed heavy, every piece of so-called damning evidence stacking up against the man sitting at the defense table. Elon Musk remained composed. No flicker of concern, no beads of sweat forming at his brow. If anything, he looked almost amused. Then, with the same calculated confidence he had carried into every boardroom, every product launch, every market-shifting decision of his career, Musk tilted his head slightly and spoke. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice even, almost casual, "I'd like you to present one piece of conclusive, indisputable evidence that proves your case against me. Just one. The most solid thing you have." The request, though simple in form, carried an undertone that no one missed. It wasn't desperation, it was strategy. A flicker of hesitation passed over Whitaker's face, barely perceptible, but there. He glanced at the mountain of evidence on his table, as if sifting through his mind for the perfect weapon. Then, after a brief pause, he reached for a thick manila folder, slid it across the table, and held it up for the court to see. "This," he declared, "is an internal document from Tesla's financial division. A confidential report signed by Mr. Musk himself, outlining how his company would circumvent financial regulations to gain an unfair market advantage. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. The smoking gun. The endgame. Musk leaned forward slightly, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached out, took the folder, and slowly flipped it open. The courtroom watched in collective anticipation as Musk scanned the pages. He turned one, then another. His expression remained unchanged, until, quite suddenly, he let out a soft chuckle. At first, it was barely audible, a small exhale of amusement. But as he turned another page, the chuckle grew, rolling into something dangerously close to full-fledged laughter. Everyone was staring now. The jury, the judge, even the prosecutor, whose confidence flickered just slightly at the unexpected reaction. Judge Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Something funny, Mr. Musk?" Musk let the moment linger, then set the document down on the table, tapping it lightly with his fingers. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly before looking up at Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice still carrying the trace of amusement, "are you absolutely sure you want to use this as evidence?" The question landed like a grenade in the room. The murmurs surged again, the tension mounting. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "I wouldn't have submitted it if I weren't, Mr. Musk." Musk nodded slowly. Then, in one fluid motion, he lifted the document for the court to see and pointed to the bottom of the page. "Then perhaps," he said, "you can explain to the court why the signature on this document isn't mine." The room froze. Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me." Musk turned the document slightly, angling it toward the judge. "Your Honor, would you mind taking a closer look at the signature? I think you'll find that it doesn't match my legal signature, which, I assume, is somewhere in your court records." The judge hesitated only a moment before motioning for the document. A clerk retrieved it and handed it over. Hayes adjusted his glasses, scrutinizing the signature. His brow furrowed. Whitaker shifted, clearly thrown off balance. That's ridiculous. The document was obtained through official channels." Musk shrugged. "I'm sure it was. But that doesn't make it legitimate, does it?" The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but hesitated. The weight of the accusation, the idea that the prosecution's so-called strongest piece of evidence might have been tampered with, sent a visible ripple of doubt through the jury. Judge Hayes set the document down carefully. He looked at Whitaker, his expression neutral but firm. "Mr. Whitaker, I assume you verified the authenticity of this document?" The question was a test, and everyone knew it. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. "We obtained it through a whistleblower from within Tesla." Musk nodded knowingly. "Oh, whistleblower. The most unbiased and impartial source of evidence, I'm sure." His tone was light, but the sarcasm underneath cut sharp. Whitaker pushed forward. "The contents of the document still reflect the reality of Tesla's financial maneuvers." Musk leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. "Do they? Because if the signature is falsified, then the authenticity of the entire document is questionable at best, fabricated at worst." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And if this, your so-called strongest piece of evidence, is unreliable, then I wonder, what does that say about the rest of your case?" A silence swept through the courtroom, thick and suffocating. The prosecutor's once commanding presence now seemed smaller, his argument suddenly fractured. For the first time since the trial had begun, the balance of power had shifted, and Elon Musk had just taken control of the game. Part 4. Breaking every argument with intellect. The air in the courtroom had changed. Just moments ago, the prosecution had been in control, their so-called irrefutable evidence poised to bring Elon Musk to his knees. But now, after Musk's effortless dismantling of their smoking gun, the room was thick with disbelief. Even the judge, a man known for his unwavering composure, looked genuinely intrigued. Musk, however, was just getting started. He casually flipped through the document again, his fingers tracing the printed words as if examining an engineering blueprint. Then, he looked up, locking eyes with Whitaker. "You know," Musk said, his voice carrying an almost conversational ease, "I was going to stop at the signature issue. But now, I'm just curious. Did anyone actually read this before presenting it as evidence? Whitaker's jaw tightened. Of course we did. Musk smirked. Then I assume you noticed this. With that, he lifted the document for the entire courtroom to see and pointed to a small, nearly imperceptible detail near the bottom of the page. Do you see this official regulatory stamp? Whitaker squinted. Yes, and Musk's smirk widened. It's fake. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge straightened in his chair. Whitaker's confidence wavered for just a second, but Musk had already seen it. He pressed on. This stamp is supposed to indicate that this document was officially filed with the SEC, Musk continued. But here's the problem. The SEC stopped using this exact seal format 3 years ago. The real stamp has an updated design, which anyone who's actually worked with financial compliance would know. Silence. Then a low gasp from the gallery. Musk turned the document toward the judge. Your Honor, feel free to verify this yourself. It'll take all of 5 minutes. Judge Hayes hesitated for only a moment before gesturing to the court clerk. The document was handed over, and the judge examined it closely. The courtroom held its breath. Finally, Hayes looked up, his expression unreadable. Mr. Whitaker, he said slowly, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. He flipped through his notes, searching for a rebuttal, for a way out. Musk leaned back, watching him struggle. No rush, he said lightly. I know how difficult it can be to defend bad data. The prosecutor exhaled sharply. This doesn't change the essence of the case, Your Honor. Mr. Musk's financial practices still violated regulations. Musk's eyes gleamed. Ah, yes, the regulations. I was hoping we'd get to that. The judge glanced at him. What are you implying, Mr. Musk? Musk stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket. I'm implying, Your Honor, that even if this document were real, and we now know it's not, the case against me still wouldn't hold. Whitaker's frustration flared. That's ridiculous. Musk turned to him, his expression completely unbothered. Is it because you've built your entire case on regulations that are contradictory and outdated? The prosecutor scoffed. That's a weak excuse. The law is the law, Mr. Musk. Musk smiled, the kind of smile that signaled he was about to turn the entire argument inside out. Tell me, Mr. Whitaker, he said, pacing slowly in front of the jury. As a prosecutor, you believe in the consistency of the law, correct? Whitaker crossed his arms. Of course. Musk nodded. Good, because that's where your problem begins. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution is basing their entire argument on a regulatory clause written in a time when the very concept of digital assets, algorithmic trading, and decentralized finance didn't even exist. This law, Section March 2nd, 47 of the Financial Market Compliance Act, was written to regulate physical, paper-based financial transactions. The legal framework they're using against me wasn't designed for the modern economy. Whitaker tried to interject, but Musk kept going. Worse yet, Musk continued, flipping to another marked section in the legal code. If I had followed the rules they claim I violated, I would have actually been in direct violation of another federal financial statute that supersedes it. The judge's brow furrowed. Explain. Musk held up 2 pages side by side. This law, he said, pointing to the first, says companies must disclose certain trading strategies if they meet a threshold set by an older regulatory framework. Then he pointed to the second page. But this law, passed just last year, specifically states that companies in my industry aren't required to disclose such strategies because the technology falls outside of traditional classification. He set the papers down. So which one do I follow, Your Honor? The room was dead silent. Whitaker's face had drained of color. He was flipping through his notes furiously, trying to find a counterargument, but Musk wasn't finished. This, Musk said, gesturing to the tangled web of outdated regulations, is what happens when laws don't evolve as fast as innovation does. You end up with contradictions. And contradictions, Your Honor, are the foundation of bad logic. He turned to the jury, his voice steady. And if there's one thing I know, bad logic leads to bad decisions. Judge Hayes tapped his fingers against the bench, visibly contemplating Musk's words. This was no longer a case about corporate misconduct. It was something much bigger. Whitaker, still grasping for control, scoffed. You're using technicalities to escape accountability. Musk tilted his head. You mean like the technicalities your case depends on? The prosecutor had no immediate response. Musk exhaled, then took a final, deliberate step forward. There's a principle in physics, he said, his voice dropping just slightly, making the courtroom lean in closer. If a system is built on false assumptions, every calculation that follows is invalid. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. This case, he said, gesturing to the prosecution's entire argument, is built on flawed assumptions. Laws that don't fit the reality they're supposed to govern. Outdated frameworks applied to an industry they were never designed for. Then, in a final move that left the courtroom stunned, he turned to the judge and said, "So tell me, Your Honor, are we really here to enforce justice?" A pause, a charged, heavy silence. Or are we just trying to punish progress? No one spoke. No one even breathed. And for the first time since the trial began, the judge didn't seem so sure anymore. Part 5. The judge had to change their perspective. For the first time in the trial, Judge Nathaniel Hayes said nothing. The usually unwavering, hardline judge, known for tearing through corporate defenses and exposing every legal loophole, sat in silence, his fingers tapping lightly against the bench. His eyes moved across the documents before him, rereading, recalculating. He was a man who prided himself on control, on knowing every angle of a case before it even began. But now, for the first time in years, he was unsure. The courtroom, once a stage for confident prosecution in a seemingly airtight case, now felt different. The weight had shifted. Musk was no longer the man on trial. The legal system itself was. A bead of sweat formed on the temple of James Whitaker, the lead prosecutor. His hands, once so steady while flipping through documents and delivering his opening remarks, were now clenched into fists. He had come into this trial certain of victory, sure that Musk was just another billionaire who thought himself above the law. But Musk had flipped the script. He hadn't just defended himself. He had put the law itself on trial. Whitaker could see it in the jury's eyes. The doubt, the hesitation, the very foundation of his case, once built on ironclad confidence, was crumbling. And worst of all, he had no way to stop it. Musk sat still, watching the judge, waiting. Then, slowly, Judge Hayes removed his glasses, exhaled deeply, and nodded. A silent but powerful gesture, one that spoke volumes. Whitaker's stomach twisted. This was slipping away. The judge cleared his throat and leaned forward. His voice, still steady, now carried something different, something more contemplative, almost reluctant. "Mr. Musk," he began, choosing his words carefully. "What you're arguing is unconventional. You're saying that the law itself is flawed, not that you didn't violate it." Musk finally spoke. His voice was smooth, patient, like a teacher explaining something to a student who was just starting to understand. "What I'm saying, Your Honor, is that we're applying old rules to a new world. We're trying to regulate the internet with laws written before the internet existed. We're using financial policies designed for paper transactions to govern digital economies. We're treating innovation as crime because we don't know how to categorize it yet." His eyes scanned the courtroom before delivering the final blow. "I didn't break the law. The law broke itself, trying to keep up with the world." The words hung in the air, reverberating through the room. Whitaker opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because what could he say? The evidence, the regulations, even his own arguments were all tangled in contradictions that Musk had methodically exposed. Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, hands folded. He studied Musk as if seeing him in a new light. This man wasn't just fighting a case. He was forcing a reckoning. The judge turned to Whitaker, who now looked like a man trapped in an unwinnable chess game. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said, his tone more measured now, "do you have anything further to add?" Whitaker swallowed. He could push forward, try to salvage what was left, insist on a ruling based on outdated precedents. But the jury's expressions said it all. They weren't convinced anymore. He had lost them. After a long, painful pause, Whitaker exhaled sharply and shook his head. "No further questions, Your Honor." Checkmate. Musk sat back, the hint of a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He had known how this would end the moment the trial began, because while the prosecution had been building a case, he had been redefining the battlefield. Part 6. The final verdict. The courtroom, once buzzing with tension and certainty, now felt unsettled, as if the very ground beneath it had shifted. Judge Nathaniel Hayes sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. His fingers tapped lightly against the bench, his gaze scanning the room, taking in the faces of the jury, the prosecution, and finally Elon Musk. There was no doubt left. No grand speech could undo what had just happened. Finally, with the weight of the moment pressing down on him, Judge Hayes exhaled. Then he picked up his gavel, straightened his posture, and delivered the words that would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The court finds insufficient grounds to proceed with this case further. The words landed like a thunderclap. A beat of silence, then chaos. Reporters gasped, pens scratching furiously against notepads. Spectators exchanged stunned glances, some whispering, some simply sitting frozen in disbelief. Even the jury, who had spent the last several hours witnessing Musk systematically dismantle the prosecution's case, seemed caught off guard. Whitaker, the once unshakable prosecutor, remained completely still. His face, drained of all its earlier confidence, showed no sign of protest, no last-minute rebuttal. He simply stared at the judge, his mouth slightly open, searching for words that refused to come. Because what was left to say? He had thrown everything at Musk. Documents, audio recordings, regulations. And yet, Musk had torn through it all, not with deception, not with denial, but with pure, irrefutable logic. And now he had won. Across the room, Musk didn't move at first. He simply absorbed the moment, as if he had already played it out in his mind 100 times before. Then, slowly he stood. There was no arrogance in his movements, no celebratory fist pump or smug victory pose. Instead, he adjusted his suit jacket, turned to face the judge, and gave a slight nod, one of acknowledgement, not defiance. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for him. Cameras flashed. Journalists scrambled to position themselves. Murmurs followed him as he made his way through the aisle. But Musk didn't slow. He didn't acknowledge the noise, the eyes, or even the whispers of how did he do that. And he just changed everything. Because to him, this wasn't about winning. It was about proving a point, that the law is not a weapon to suppress innovation, that progress is not crime, and that sometimes when the rules no longer fit the world they govern, the only way forward is to challenge them. As Musk reached the doors, a reporter called out over the noise, "Mr. Musk, how does it feel to walk away free?" Musk paused. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smirk, he reached into his pocket, put on his sunglasses, and said, "Feels like logic did its job." And with that, he stepped into the world, not as a man who had escaped justice, but as a man who had forced it to evolve. Part 7. The aftermath, a legal earthquake. By the time Elon Musk had stepped out of the courthouse, the world was already on fire. Headlines erupted across every major news outlet. Elon Musk, the man who forced the law to evolve. The New York Times, brilliant or dangerous? How Musk used logic to escape a case that seemed ironclad. The Wall Street Journal. A legal genius or a master manipulator? The trial that exposed the system's flaws. BBC News. Twitter, or rather, X, as Musk had rebranded it, exploded. Musk just played 4D chess in a courtroom and made the prosecution look like they brought checkers pieces. Absolute masterclass. Hashtag Musk versus the law. If the law is outdated, whose fault is it? Musk's, or the people who refuse to update the rules? Think about it. Hashtag innovation versus regulation. This trial should scare every regulator. If Musk can tear apart financial laws this easily, what does that say about the rest of our system? For legal experts, the case wasn't just a victory. It was a wake-up call. Within hours, law firms, regulatory agencies, and policymakers found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable question Musk had forced into the spotlight. If the law is too outdated to govern the future, does it even serve justice anymore? Corporate lawyers, once confident in their arsenal of statutes and precedents, were suddenly questioning their entire approach. In a fiery panel discussion on CNN, top legal minds clashed over the implications. What Musk did wasn't just win a case. He exposed a critical flaw in the way we apply law to innovation, argued Linda Cartwright, a former SEC regulator. If our legal framework can't keep up with technological advancements, we will always be punishing progress instead of regulating it intelligently. That's a dangerous precedent, countered Paul Dunning, a federal prosecutor. What he did was exploit legal loopholes. What happens when others try to do the same thing? Do we just let them go because the laws weren't written in their era? Cartwright shook her head. No. What we do is rewrite the laws so they make sense for the world we live in. But the biggest debate, the one that no one could ignore, came from a chilling realization. If Musk could outmaneuver the system because he had the intelligence and resources to do so, how many people had already been convicted simply because they lacked the knowledge to fight back? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Across the country, people who had been penalized for unknowingly violating outdated laws began speaking out. I was fined thousands for a tax regulation that even my accountant didn't understand. Maybe if I had Musk's brain, I'd still have my money. If ignorance of the law isn't an excuse, then what happens when the law itself is ignorant? We need more people like Musk, not to escape justice, but to make sure the system itself is just. And so, the trial was over, but the conversation had just begun. Elon Musk hadn't just won. He had forced the world to rethink everything.